14th. Now, the media are telling you he's an American, he's a White Sox fan, but we have the full portrait of the new Pope and what it means to the Church on this edition of the Conclave Crew. Welcome to this Arroyo Grande series, the Conclave Crew, Vatican Edition, Episode 6. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Taylor Fragon Capital Management, Faith, Family, and Finances. Visit them at taylorfragon.com, as well as Floriani, revitalizing sacred music at floriani.org. Who is the new Pope Leo XIV? Let's convene the crew. Father Gerald Murray, canon lawyer from the Archdiocese of New York, and Robert Royal, editor-in-chief at thecatholicthing.org. Gents, thanks for being here. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Go subscribe to the Arroyo Grande podcast on iHeart, Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube at the Arroyo Grande Show page, and like this episode. Pope Leo XIV, Robert Prevost, was the dark horse candidate in this conclave. We even discussed him in earlier episodes, including yesterday. Robert, you called him out. You mentioned him, actually. We were in that discussion. Some online were giving him credit for that. So here, I'm tipping my hat to you, Robert. He's a 69-year-old Chicago native, an Augustinian priest. He spent most of his life as a missionary bishop in Peru. Then he was tapped by Pope Francis to run the Vatican office that selects and appoints bishops 3 years ago. 2 years ago, he was made a cardinal. His appearance was greeted with cheers in St. Peter's Square. Jance, let's start with the name. I have to tell you, I was standing in the square. The Italians were not too happy with this selection. The Americans were jubilant. The Italians were a little less so. Let's start with the name. From Leo the Great, there have been 13 popes with that name, Leo. Why do you think he chose it, Father Jerry?
I think he's signaling that he wants to continue with the teaching of Pope Leo XIII, who is the father of Catholic social teaching in the modern era, and precisely because Leo XIII was a great defender of the working man, of the rights of workers to organize, to form unions. But we also have to remember that he also condemned socialism, and he defended the right to private property, which in reality is also part of Catholic social teaching, despite what some social justice warriors occasionally claim. So I think this is a very important signal that he's very interested in the social teaching of the Church, maintaining a presence in the, we could say, the public square as regards economic life.
Bob, any further reflections on that choice of Leo? I was surprised, actually. Another Leo.
I was too, I must say. And look, Benedict XVI chose to follow Benedict XV, who was early in the 20th century and helped to build up a sense of peace at a time of war. I get the impression that Leo XIV wants to reach back, as Father was saying, to that foundation of modern Catholic social thought in Leo XIII. In my book, A Deeper Vision, which is about the modern Catholic intellectual tradition, I have a great an intricate and careful analysis of what Leo did. And one of the things that Leo did was he also created the resurgence of studies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he linked the two. So much so that my friend Russell Hittinger, who's an expert on natural law and modern Catholic social thought, has pointed out that Leo never talked about social thought without mentioning St. Thomas. Now, I don't know that Leo XIV has exactly got that in mind, but I would hope that he would not just accept the framework of modern politics and economics, but would actually be reaching deeply into our Catholic tradition of thinking about society and bring something new and dynamic and creative to a circumstance that is very, very troubling in many ways.
Father, what did you make of the Mosetta that he was wearing, that red cape that is traditional for the Pope to wear? I mean, we did not see that from Pope Francis. I mean, though he is considered, Leo XIV is considered to be in the vein of Pope Francis, and we'll get into that in a moment, but contrast that image with that of Pope Francis the first time we saw him.
Yes, Pope Leo made the conscious choice to observe the traditional practice that popes come out, they're wearing the white cassock for the first time, but then they're wearing the Mosetta, which is red, which is the symbol of a bishop. They're wearing the Pope wears then the red stole, symbolizing martyrdom. And then there are two martyrs pictured on that, Peter and Paul, who are the two founders, we say, of the church in Rome. And then he, of course, then followed the ritual very carefully, because there's a ritual with some prayers which go back, to the old Mass. Even those prayers, I was listening to them. He has, by the way, his Latin is very good. He said the words beautifully. He had written out his comments in Italian, which probably reflects the fact that he doesn't think spontaneously in Italian, so he wanted to have them written. But they were good remarks. So I was impressed. He was sending a signal of continuity with previous popes. Pope Francis, basically, we learned from sources that he viewed that as too much of a spectacle, and he didn't want to participate in it. But in a way, you could say that Pope Leo was subsuming his personality right into the office and was stepping away from making, how can we say, statements that indicate personal preferences.
He did say in his first address, and I remember, I couldn't make it all out because, as we've been commenting, it was very hard to hear in St. Peter's Square or above it. He did say we need to be a synodal church and reach out in dialogue and encounter. What does that mean, Robert Royal?
Well, look, it can mean any number of things, because as we've said over and over again, synodality itself is kind of an empty sack that could be either filled or not filled, depending on who the Pope happens to be. Yeah, he really did emphasize the continuity with Francis quite a bit, but as Father rightly says, not only in the way that he vested himself, or was vested for the event yesterday, but the way he carries himself. He conveys, I've spoken to a number of people back home in America as well as here in Rome, and the way he conducts himself is as a serious man, a mature man who's careful about what he says, and brings a kind of I think he brings back a little bit of the majesty already of what the Pope is like, even though he's an American and we're not supposed to have, sort of that kind of mentality in us. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, because you can be in continuity with the previous Pope and yet at the same time practice a certain innovation. And the very fact that he chose that name, that jumped back a century and more to the name of Leo, it'll be interesting to see where he goes. And I don't think we can predict.
Father, I thought of you when I heard that. We were standing on the balcony together. You were doing a hit, and I was right there. And I thought, my gosh, how much time have we spent trying to determine what the term synodality means? And here's the Pope saying, we need a synodal church. I've been waiting for this. What is your take on that? And what do you think he intends?
Well, I think he's signaling to the cardinals and others, particularly the cardinals who voted for him, that he is going to not stop this synodal process that Pope Francis began, because it's quite clear those who criticized the synodal path were hoping to elect a pope who would put an end to it. That certainly was my hope, because synodality is a vague concept, and it really is a change from what it originally meant. Synodality is based on the word synod. Synod in the modern sense was created by Paul VI after Vatican II to have a forum in which bishops throughout the world would meet periodically to advise the Pope on the needs of the church in the modern world. Pope Francis turned it into a meeting of laity, priests, deacons, nuns, and bishops, and gave everybody an equal vote. And this was indicative. It's kind of like it was a stage post, or a way station on the way to what they're going to have in 2028, which is the ecclesial assembly, in which bishops will not be the majority in Rome. And I wrote a column at the Catholic thing tearing into it, which it deserves to be. We are not a church in which the hierarchy is an appendage. It's a hierarchical church with synodal experiences. It's not a synodal church with hierarchical appendages. That's what I'm very much afraid of. So it's not clear what Pope Leo means by synodal church, but if it means the ecclesial assembly in 2028, well, get ready, because there's going to be a lot of opposition based on the fact that this is completely at odds with the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church.
Well, it's also at odds with the founding of the church. The Lord didn't bring all the disciples and everybody following him through Galilee and say, hey, guys, you all have the power to loose and bind. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, and loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. No, he gave that only to Peter and then to the apostles. It's a very limited group. So it does kind of corrupt the vision of church governance when you start bringing atheists in and non-believers in, everybody and their dog in, and then and only a select group of cardinals who agree with you. That's a problem. Bob, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I think that the next stage to look toward, because Father's right, that 2028 is, if that's going to continue on the way it was originally planned, that's going to be a big problem.
Which Pope Francis approved from the Gemelli Clinic, from his hospital bed.
But we know that in June, those 10 study groups that were established at the end of the last synod in October, that basically took the hot button issues off the table, women deacons, all that sort of stuff. Their reports are due in June. So presumably those committees have been working on this all this time, in spite of the fact that Francis was ill. They're supposed to deliver reports in June. If they do that and they are submitted to Pope Leo, we can see how he reacts to that, what he's going to do with them. Does he immediately kind of publish them, or does he say, well, let me think this over a bit? That'll be our first indication, I think our first solid indication of what he intends to do.
Look, we always said, and I was told by cardinals, including many of whom we had meetings and dinners and encounters with over the last 10 days or so, that an American could not be named Pope. America's already powerful enough. You don't need an American Pope. Yet Pope Leo is the first American in history. Why do you think they elected him, Father? I'm told in part because of the financial straits of the Vatican. A $2 billion deficit, $400 million in unpaid pensions. Father, why an American?
Well, I think that's one of the two important reasons. Well, there are a number of reasons, but I'll give two that I think are important. One is precisely this. They understand that someone coming from what we call the Anglosphere, in other words, the Anglo-Saxon world, English-speaking world, that financial competence and rigor are normal in the operations of the economies of England, Australia, Canada, and the United States. And therefore, there's hope that he will bring that kind of vision to the reform here, because we're talking $2 billion pension hold. We're talking major operating deficits every year. We're talking mismanagement of assets. So hopefully Pope Leo will bring in some very serious and powerful minds and voices to say, no, we're going to top to bottom renewal. Secondly, he really is a Latin American in experience because his priesthood was lived in Peru at the beginning, and then at the end when he was a bishop in Chiclayo. His Spanish is perfect. So he is, by experience, he's really a Latin American, but he's also a North American. So he's both Americans. I think that was attractive. Other reasons, of course, has to do with the fact that he was appointed to this important position at the Dicastery of Bishops by Pope Francis and made a cardinal by him. So the continuity with Pope Francis is assumed by those who voted for him, because they would say he wouldn't be here to be elected Pope if it weren't for Pope Francis. Those are some of the things I think are going on.
Bob, how do you think this will impact having an American Pope, Pope Leo? How will that impact his relationship with America, which we have to say has been tense since Trump came to town?
Yeah. Look, I hear some people saying, and this is part of that over-speculation that takes place at a moment like this. I hear some people saying that the cardinals chose him to confront Trump. I think this is utter nonsense, because what they're primarily concerned about are some of the issues we just mentioned that are really pressing on the church at this moment. In fact, it might actually help that he knows the United States pretty well. I was a little bit disappointed that he didn't use any English during his initial address last evening, because look, he is very much a Latin American now. He's very much a Roman. He's spent a number of years now in Rome. But darn it, you are who you are. I mean, if you started on the south side of Chicago, I think you ought to be proud of that. And it's, we are all sensitive to the cultural issues like synodality, homosexuality, women priests, all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But I think he's shown himself to be a safe pair of hands. And as I said earlier, he's impressed a number of people. He's even impressed me. I mean, I'm just seeing him on TV. But the emotion that he showed last night and the kind of maturity that he seems to radiate, I think if you were looking around and saying, look, we need to clean house here in Rome and calm down a bit and take some of those practical steps that we know we need to take, but we don't seem to have been able to do, you could be worse. And on top of it, he knows a lot of these bishops who've been appointed because he was the head man in that office. So there are a number of things that come together that could be helpful. He probably isn't going to look that American to most Americans back in North America, but he is an American. Yeah, and I won't rub it in I won't rub it in that I predicted yesterday that it is not impossible.
Well, we have the video evidence, unfortunately, or I would deprive you of that, but I can't. And look, in his first Mass at the Sistine Chapel, the Pope used the crozier of Pope Benedict. So it's being reported. Others say that crozier is actually Paul VI. I don't know who's right here. But does that have any meaning, Father?
Yes, and he also began the sermon in English. He did off-the-cuff remarks in English. I think somebody told him, the Americans are waiting for you to talk in English at the balcony, which he didn't do. Yeah, I mean, he's stressing continuity and with not just Pope Francis, but Pope Benedict and even John Paul. He had quoted John Paul, and let's just say this, the sermon was a very serious sermon in which he talked about practical atheism, talked about challenges in the modern world that the church faces. He talked about the necessity of preaching the gospel to the world. Christocentric, we would say, centered on Christ. So I was impressed with the sermon, and I think the cardinals listening were too.
Yeah, look, anytime you mention Ignatius of Antioch and giving yourself, for the faith, that's pretty good stuff. I want to give the audience a little taste. This is the opening of his homily, which he pronounced in English. Watch.
I'll begin with a word in English, and the rest is in Italian. But I want to repeat the words from the responsorial psalm. I will sing a new song to the Lord because he has done marvels. And indeed, not just with me, but with all of us, my brother cardinals, as we celebrate this morning, I invite you to recognize the marvels that the Lord has done, the blessings that the Lord continues to pour out upon all of us. Through the ministry of Peter, you have called me to carry that cross and to be blessed with that mission. And I know I can rely on each and every one of you to walk with me as we continue as a church, as a community of friends of Jesus, as believers, to announce the good news, to announce the gospel.
Bob, what do you make of that?
Well, it's nice. And we had a pope. A priest pointed out to me a little while ago that Pope Francis was really the only modern pope in the 20th century and on who didn't speak English. And that doubtless tilted his understanding of the world somewhat. And I think we have to expect that Pope Leo is also, because he's largely now a Latin American and his mentality is going to be absorbed somewhat into that view. But if he's very serious about presenting the gospel to the world, and he's serious about how the church is going to form the world at this moment of transition that we seem to be in a variety of ways. We're going to have to bring in some new energies, and I think some of those energies are going to have to come from English-speaking sources, because we're the place where, the modern world has actually succeeded, at least economically, more or less politically. We have all kinds of crises in the English-speaking world. But for him to step out with that, I think, is going to expand the mentality a little bit, because what language you use makes a difference.
Yeah, well, and our confrere, Father Murray, said yesterday on the podcast that this should be the basic and foundational language used at the Vatican, that it should be English. Maybe he's listening to the podcast, Father.
Well, in a global world, you want to imitate the UN, start using English. I mean, yeah, it's, I've thought this for a long time. English is the language. I mean, airplane pilots have to know English. It's a practicality that things get done easily when people can understand each other. So yeah, that would be a basic step. Italian is a minor language in the overall world picture. It's important because it's the language of the Holy See.
We had a few comments. Some were saying, oh, Father Murray's saying we should replace the Latin with English. No, no, no. He's saying the language used to converse in Vatican offices and in the Vatican city-state, right now it's Italian. It's not Latin.
Yeah, no, and let me note this. He's a canon lawyer, the new pope, and I'm a canon lawyer, so I like that. But I like it for other reasons, but, you know, one of which is the law is written in Latin, because that is a whole history up to this point. And then with all the different translations, it's good to have a reference point. So canon law should stay in Latin. But yeah, I mean, office memos in English would be very practical.
Father, Pope Leo has asked all the Curial Heads, that means all the men who run, and women in some cases, these various dicasteries in the Vatican offices, he's asked them to stay in their positions for the time being, to keep their respective jobs until further notice. What does that tell you?
Yeah, that's a standard practice when the new pope comes in, and it's a wise practice because, you know, when the offices reopen after this, you know, momentous time of the pope's death and burial and now the election of new pope, you know, there's a lot of work that has to be done, and if the leader is not there at each of these departments, it becomes a little bit difficult. But the tell, as they would say, is going to be who does he replace and who does he keep in place, because you know, the heads of these dicasteries were very much disciples of Pope Francis and often proponents of implementing radical ideas at a accelerated pace even. So we'll get a read on Pope Leo's continuity program by seeing who's left and who's replaced.
Bob, Pope Leo spent a lot of time in Peru. How does that experience, that missionary experience, shape this pontificate? I mean, you heard it in his opening comment when he was on the loggia the other day. Basically, that the pastors should smell of the sheep and they have to walk with the people.
Yeah, Peru has been a very troubled place. Most English speakers in North America don't know much about Peru, but Peru went through a terrible period toward the end of the 20th century with a movement called Sendero Luminoso, which was a Marxist import from China. It just ripped up the whole society. They began to reform, and they've, in recent decades too, they've had a number of political ups and downs, let's put it that way. So he's confronted in Chiclayo is a relatively small diocese. I have a personal connection with it because a priest that I grew up with in my little parish in Connecticut was sent as a missionary down there. He was supposed to be there for 2 years, and he loved it, and he just stayed the whole time. And we all kind of felt close to it in where I grew up. But look, he's seen that. I think he was the vice president of the Bishops' Conference there, and so he's seen the turmoil of Latin America, and in a way, that political turmoil maybe is something that he's thinking about when he takes the name Leo XIV. But I would also say that there is a evangelizing turmoil that we know that the Pentecostals and the other sort of evangelical groups are growing by leaps and bounds in these places. And so you can lament that that's happening, but you have to do something. And in many of the places in Latin America that I'm familiar with, the reason why people leave the church is precisely because they want to get away from politics. That the church is too politicized, either for liberation theology or something or other. That's going to be a tough needle for him to thread, and it'll be interesting to keep an eye on what he does with that.
Well, that's a great intro to what we talked about the other day, which is really the challenges facing the church right now in the post-Francis era, if you will, and then now in the beginning of the Leo era. So I want to talk about how well Pope Leo might be disposed, or perhaps not, to embrace some of these challenges. In an earlier episode, we talked about the collapse of due process, Father, in the church, canonical norms under Pope Francis. They were just shattered. As you mentioned a moment ago, Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo, is a canon lawyer. Tell me, restate some of the problems that, in your mind, need addressing, and how he may approach these canonical issues, and how culpable he may be in a way that Pope Francis perhaps was not.
Well, as a canon lawyer, he knows the rules. He knows why the rules are put in place. In other words, they're not arbitrary things invented just to keep the powerful powerful. Canon law is designed to guarantee respect for the rights of everyone in the church. So the hierarchs have to follow procedures when there are questions regarding people subject to them. There are a lot of issues remaining that need to be looked at. We have sex abuse enforcement. I mean, right now we have Bishop Zanchetta, who was announced to be under a canonical process over 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember how long, but we've never heard another word about it. No. So that process has to be brought to completion because guess what? This man was convicted in a civil court in Argentina of abusing seminarians. There's no reason why this man, if guilty, found guilty in canonical process, should not be removed from the priesthood. Same with Father Marco Rupnik. He was thrown out of the Jesuits because he wouldn't cooperate with them in their investigation of sexual abuse of nuns who were under his spiritual care. So sex abuse is going to be something very important to look at. Similarly, we have to look at how investigations are done of religious orders, because Pope Francis had a hostility, and this is noted, I'm not inventing this, to more traditional and charismatic type groups in the church. Some of them had problems, there's no doubt. You know, the Sodalizio in Peru was the founder of it, was found guilty of sex abuse, and others in the group participated. But Pope Francis abolished the group, and a lot of good members felt that there was not enough due process. The Institute of the Incarnate Word is currently under investigation. Now, its founder in Argentina was also found guilty of sexual abuse of minors or seminarians. But that group is worldwide. In fact, the Pope always called the parish in Gaza, every night, and the pastor there is a member of that group. So there are a lot of groups in France have similar investigations going on. We never heard the end about the Franciscans of the Immaculate in Italy and elsewhere. They were put under a moderator and no resolution was. So there are going to be those canonical investigations that need to be completed. Opus Dei, they changed the law regarding personal prelatures. It's a complicated canonical thing, won't go into, but Opus Dei was given the opportunity to submit their own revised statutes. And they were at a meeting when the Pope died in which they were going to come up with their final proposal. So they suspended the statute proposal. The new Pope's going to have to take that up. So those are some of the things. These are canonical issues. And the reason they're important is everybody else is watching. And if these groups feel they were treated unfairly, and everyone else is going to be suspicious. If fairness is evident, that's how you have social harmony in the church.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the other areas the Pope will be contending with. The Pope Leo, when he was Cardinal Robert Prevost, is being quoted in the media as saying this in a 2012 address: Catholic pastors who preach against legalization of abortion or the redefinition of marriage are portrayed as being ideologically driven, severe, and uncaring. He went on to call out the media for depicting the, quote, homosexual lifestyle and same-sex partners with their adopted children as a challenge. Your thoughts, Bob, on these quotes and the upsetment that some gay groups are communicating today? They say, wait, this is a departure from Pope Francis. He was welcoming us, and these comments are just abrasive and hostile.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that's actually, though, 13 years ago, and the question is right now. Pope Francis said a lot of strong things about pro-life, about protecting life in the womb and protecting life at the end of natural life. But he didn't do much. And I would like to see some more action and even drum beating. Francis actually discouraged people from being obsessed and focused on the pro-life issues and the gay issues. And I think that was to his detriment, because he just kind of in advance announced, yeah, we're going to say this, but we're not going to do anything. As far as the gay thing goes, in addition to what Father was just saying about the high-handedness that Francis often showed toward these other groups, I would hope that in addition to following the law, that Leo would look deeply into why it is that it's been so difficult to move the needle within the church on homosexuality. And clearly, there is some kind of protective network that exists. It was also personal when it came to Francis with the cases of Mosetta, and it appears also with Rupnik to some degree. But we know that there's some kind of protective network here that needs to be rooted out. It simply can't go on that at a time when, as we're learning, that the young priests who are coming into the church in the United States and elsewhere are deeply, deeply satisfied being heterosexual. Homosexuals are tending not to go into the seminary, that the church, in terms of its general culture, is kind of turned. There can't any longer be this network that has protected the McCarricks and the Zanchettas and on and on and on. And he's going to have to look very carefully into this. John Paul wasn't able to do it, and we know he would like to have done it. Mm-hmm. Benedict was not able to do it, and we know he would like to have done it. Francis talked about it. He issued some documents, but we're still not very far from where we were when he became Pope. So this is a burning issue. Life and redefining sexuality in the family in a way that makes sense and stands strong against the activism of these homosexual groups.
Father, I want to invite you into this. I know you're probably champing at the bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Bob's got a very good point. And this goes back to what, remember Bishop Morino, who made a speech to the U.S. bishops and says, we have to confront the fact that there's a homosexual problem in the clergy, and this cannot be tolerated. So what it basically means is the Vatican has to make it clear. Priests who are unchaste, meaning they don't live, Christian teaching about sexual purity, they're unchaste, they are a blot on the priesthood. They have to reform their lives or be removed, because you can't have a system in which people are expected to teach a series of propositions that the church considers to be the truth, and yet they reject them in their own lives, and I'm sure in private tell people, don't pay attention to this stuff. So that's a problem. And then the more general issue is it the role of a bishop as a shepherd to protect the flock in ways that are going to upset some people? And it always is. We're not here to please governments. We're not here to please corporations. We're not here to please the homosexual lobby, which says it's unfair that the Catholic Church stigmatizes what we do. Well, the answer is, you can go where you want as a person. We hope you'll embrace Catholicism, but don't try to subvert Catholic teaching in the name of Christ, saying, well, Jesus was never severe. What do you mean he wasn't severe? Jesus is the author of the Bible, which says that homosexual activity is an abomination. So we have to get to that point, Raymond.
Are you looking for financial management that reflects your deepest values? Taylor Fergon Capital Management actively manages portfolios designed for those who prioritize faith, family, and long-term stewardship throughout their mutual fund, separately managed accounts, or family office accounts. Taylor Fergon Capital, values-driven investing to support your faith, family, and finances. There at taylorfergon.com. Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo, was head of the dicastery of bishops that selected and dispatched, we have to just say it, many bishops, notably Bishop Strickland in the United States, in Tyler, Texas, Bishop Ray in France. Both were removed. One for saying things on social media that was overboard about Pope Francis. One for being too orthodox and having really thriving seminarians in the diocese, but they were too traditional for the Vatican's taste. I read one story where Provost ran the visitation that looked into Bishop Ray. Your thoughts on what this tells us, and do you think it might restore, or he might restore, those bishops back to practice? Bob?
Well, about Strickland, I'm doubtful, although I don't have any insight into that. That, I think, was kind of a personal clash that Bishop Strickland had over what he thought that Francis was doing, and often his arguments were well taken. This question in France bothers me a bit more, because when someone is described as being too orthodox and they have too many seminarians coming in and the diocese is flourishing, it just seems to me to be normal human reaction to look at it and say, hey, why is this working?
Too many people want salvation. Too many people want to serve Jesus. What's happening?
people are showing up and they want to be priests. Well, why is there anything wrong with that? And if they're going overboard, and maybe they are, maybe there's a kind of a spirit of rebellion that can even take place in these traditional places. Well, you don't abolish it, though. What you try to do is you try to work with them. And we hear a lot that Cardinal Prevost was a listener, that he would listen and proceed in a kind of a calm, mature way to make decisions. So I'm a little worried about that, of course, because it just seems to me inexplicable. It could be that somebody put pressure on him. Certainly in the case of the appointment of McElroy in Washington, D.C., we have to think that was the hand of the Pope, specifically reaching in there and saying, I want him, move him from San Diego to Washington, D.C. So some of these decisions may not be entirely his, but he's going to have to take on the responsibilities now. If we don't want a church that is just going to continue to collapse, and it'll have a large number of faithful people, but it'll continue to collapse. Its influence will continue to collapse. The evangelization, the carrying out of the message of Jesus to the world begins to be weaker and weaker. If we don't want that, then we need to take some new directions. And it's not the ones that we've had the past 12 years. There was no Francis effect.
Father, do you want to add anything there quickly?
Well, so yes, I think it's incumbent on the Pope to restore or to give an assignment to bishops who were removed in ways I consider unjust. Bishop Daniel Fernandez in Puerto Rico has no assignment. He should be made a bishop of a diocese or an auxiliary bishop. Same with Strickland. And Bishop Ray, he was mistreated, and he should also be given an assignment, because the Pope basically removed them from their diocese as a form of punishment, but he didn't suspend them. So they still fully function as priests and Mass and confession. This is an anomalous situation. It shouldn't happen.
Okay, we talked about the sex abuse crisis a little earlier and how Pope Francis shielded friends and colleagues at times from justice, ignoring the cries of victims, it has to be said. Pope Leo has his own record in Peru and Chicago that has gotten some coverage since yesterday. A number of girls in Peru claimed a priest abused them. They went to Prevost, and they claim no investigation was ever opened. What will Pope Leo's approach be, do you think, to restore confidence and transparency in the church? What is required now, Father, briefly?
Well, this case in Peru, I read, from the point of view of the complaining people, meaning the people feel offended by what Cardinal Prevost, how he handled the matter. I think it would be good if we got an explanation of that. The Peruvian bishops issued a statement a while ago saying that he did everything right. The canon lawyer for the 3 girls who say they're abused by 2 priests say he didn't. So I think we need enlightenment on that. There's also the case in Chicago where, as head of the Augustinian order, he assigned a priest to live who'd been accused by multiple accusations of sexual abuse of minors. He was put into a rectory, which was located in close proximity to a Catholic grammar school, and that this was in fact something that Cardinal Suppic had apologized for previously, doing a similar assignment. So those things should be dealt with, and the Pope, if he says, I regret decisions I made and I apologize to the victim, it'll be over. I mean, that's just the way you clear things up.
Well, as you said the other day, just let a due process trial and investigation proceed, and then show no favoritism to anyone. Everyone is under the same law. That would restore, I think, confidence if we just did that. Over and under, before we go, will he live in the Apostolic Palace, Bob?
Yes.
Yes? Oh.
Yes, okay. I think that what we saw by the way he presented himself and whatnot, and remember, Francis didn't go to Santa Marta because it's uncomfortable or it's humble. He just didn't want to be isolated. And I think it's a much better place for the Pope to be, and he probably understands that as well.
Yeah. Father?
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's face it, it's more humble dwellings than the Santa Marta. I've been to both, I can tell you. One's like the Hilton, the other is like a little hostel. The Apostolic Palace is not the hallways are grand, but the room, it's a tiny room. I mean, it's not much, and it's drafty in the winter. One last caveat. This is not a president or prime minister. This is the 267th successor of St. Peter the Apostle, the Prince of the Apostles. And there is grace that comes with that office, and that's getting lost in a lot of these conversations I'm seeing in the media. It has power to not only remake the church, but the man who holds that office. We will watch the rise of Pope Leo XIV together and pray that God guides him and shapes him in these days to come. The Arroyo Grande Conclave Crew Vatican Edition concludes, but I think we're going to keep the posse going. Yes, guys?
Indeed.
Why not?
Yeah, let's saddle up.
Right, saddle them up.
Saddle them up. Subscribe to the Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube or the Arroyo Grande Podcast, wherever you get yours. And this series has been brought to you by our friends at Taylor Fergon Capital Management. Faith, family, and finances, they're at taylorfergon.com. On behalf of Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, we will convene again. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Rome. Ciao. We'll see you next time.